Colonel Douglas Macgregor has been watching this very, very closely and the moves over the past few hours. And Colonel, we just hear, Middle East partners, I guess, also just within the last hour or so asking President Trump, like, please stop this madness. I assume that Iran would then begin to target and hit the UAE and other energy infrastructure, desalinization operations inside of the UAE, Bahrain, God knows what else. Is that the pressure being applied to President Trump right now?
That presumes that he feels pressure, and I'm not sure he does. Whenever he's been questioned about the economic implication, crises, and so forth, he waves it off as though, no, this doesn't matter. And whatever pain the American people are suffering, it'll be short term. I think we've heard that sort of thing before. It didn't turn out to be that way. But nevertheless, that's his position. So I think right now, if you look objectively at all the indications or indicators of military action, what we've got out there in terms of air and naval power, and even now substantial light forces, light ground forces, I would say that the renewed war is a certainty. I would expect it to happen anytime.
A certainty.
I mean, what he's saying now within the last hour is it was going to be tomorrow. Gulf leaders have asked me to hold off because talks are positive. But again, he's reiterating no nuclear weapons or nuclear of any kind for Iran. But was going to be tomorrow. We're just going to push that off. But it's clear. I mean, it's clear something is coming, right?
I think we're going to go back into the same war we were in before. I think with more force than he did previously. I'm sure that's what the general officers are promising him and the admirals are telling him. And, what was the definition of insanity that Einstein used to offer?
Doing the same, expecting different results.
Yeah, and I think that's where we are. Now, the other thing that nobody's considering is the possibility that Iran, whose forces are supplied, replenished, and so forth, may reveal some new capabilities we haven't encountered yet. That's a possibility. We don't exactly know with great everything that the Russians and the Chinese have provided to them. And we do admit privately that we grossly underestimated the engineering skills of the Iranians. So this could turn out to be a lot worse on both sides than it was the last time. I think that's very much
and I'm just curious about the Middle East partnership of all of this, and on the United States side, but more specifically on the attacks that would come from Iran. The idea that Iran would, frankly, devastate the UAE, really wipe Dubai off the map for all intents and purposes, hitting, again, energy infrastructure, desalinization. Like, the list is pretty extensive, what they would hit, rendering that country basically useless. Does President Trump seem to care about that?
Well, as I said before, I think that's a tertiary concern as far as he's concerned. And I think in private, the leadership is probably cheering him on, despite what you just described as a likely outcome. Let me explain that. I think people need to understand that the UAE is very much a Trojan horse for Israeli and American power and influence. And it has been a thorn in the side of Iran for a very long time. If you're an Iranian, you very much welcome the opportunity to annihilate this platform for the projection of power against you. So the UAE will definitely be struck, and most of it will be flattened or destroyed. Now, I don't know where all the money goes. It's probably sitting in New York City, London, other places. But you're right. The majority of the population, I think we had at the beginning of the war, an estimated 67 million people living from Iraq's border on the west coast of the Persian Gulf all the way down to Oman. I don't think there's half of that left at this point. And I think more will leave. They'll bundle up in their automobiles or SUVs. They'll drive across the desert to Riyadh. And from Riyadh, you can get an aircraft flight to various places. So it's inevitable. And I think President Trump has really played the media for suckers. How many times has he manipulated the stock market and investors? And most investors really believe that one of two things is going to happen. Either Trump tacos, as they like to say, chickens out, leaves, or Trump doubles down and crushes Iran. I mean, when you talk to people, they say, "Oh, well, the Marines and the Navy, they'll seize the strait, they'll march in, they'll take all this over. This won't last much longer." They have no idea what the topography is like. They don't understand what they're dealing with. They don't understand the climate, the conditions. They absolutely have no idea what kind of capabilities we're up against, particularly in air and missile defense. So at this stage, I'd say yes, we're going to see the war restart. It'll probably last as long as the last phase did. And I see no evidence that the Iranians are going to do anything remotely along the lines of what President Trump expects or would like.
Israel in this.
Well, if you're an Israeli right now, your view is, for the moment, you have control of the United States Armed Forces and its government. You know, this is a unique point in the history of the Israeli state. They have, for many decades, tried very hard to gain control in terms of voting power on the Hill, enough people to guarantee the flow of aid and support to Israel. Well, you know, that was relatively unchallenging. But what they know now is that this war has had a distinctly negative impact on public opinion in the United States regarding Israel. Now, public opinion hasn't mattered a great deal. You know, we've gone to war before, whether or not the American people were consulted or wanted it. And this is a perfect example of doing that yet again. This time, Congress didn't even receive a note in the mail. It was Congress stood up and gave the obligatory standing ovation when the State of the Union was given, and Israel and Iran were mentioned. So, you know, at this point, everybody's on board. This is Tucker Carlson's ship of fools, full steam ahead. And
Right.
the American people, but it doesn't matter.
I want to ask you about whether or not the military is with it, because the morale of the military, especially the soldiers who were stranded above the USS Gerald Ford, which just did return to Virginia over the weekend, but I believe it was a 326-day deployment, which was one of the longest sea assignments in over half of a century. They didn't know they would be out there this long. They didn't mean to. Many of them are going to say, I'm not doing that again. I don't know if it will have much impact on recruitment, but a lot of them will say, forget this. What is the temperament of the military that the president is relying on?
Well, you're correct about soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at lower levels. A lot of them are fed up. There's no question about it. They're tired of being abused. What we've been through this now is 20 years. In fact, I would say more than 20 years. And the attitude in the senior ranks is, so what? There are more where they came from. I mean, literally, that's been my experience. These people don't like it. Don't worry about it. We can enlist other people. And when you tell them, well, you may not get the quality recruits that you need, well, we've been through that before. That doesn't matter either. So, you know, to be perfectly blunt, I think the senior officers are not going to give that much thought. They just won't. So let's turn to the senior officers, the 4 stars and 3 stars. Remember what every general wants. Every general wants another star. And the 3s all want to be 4 stars. And the 4 stars all want to follow the career path that David Petraeus and Jack Keane and others have followed. What, Kurilla has done, even McKenzie, who was the architect of the disaster when we left Afghanistan, they have all bent the knee to Israel. They have all gone to the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy and said, verily, I swear allegiance, I will do as directed. So everybody's lined up because they look at what happens when the senior officers retire, who unhesitatingly, unquestioningly obey these orders and execute. They get filthy rich in retirement. And then as you go down through the ranks, all the way down to full colonels, brigadier generals, major generals, they want part of the action. They know they can't get the political favors, the financial opportunities that are given to the 3s and 4s, but they want to be part of it. So they've got their hands out and they're looking for jobs too. So if you're waiting for the senior ranks to stand up and be counted and say, we find this reprehensible. This is not morally consistent with my values. My moral conscience will not permit me to obey these orders. I think you're in for a very long wait. You're not going to hear that. You're going to be very disappointed.
Colonel, I guess we'll get you out of here on this. I'm curious about the missiles, the United States stockpiles. I keep reading reports about how depleted they've been. Could take up to 3 to 5 years to try to, get back the THAAD systems, Patriot systems, all of this that we've exhausted in just a few weeks against Iran. Are we even prepared militarily with stockpiles and munitions to go in and carry out some sort of a massive regime change operation at this stage?
No, you're not going to see a massive regime change. But what we do have the capability of doing is mass destruction of Iran's infrastructure and much of its society. And right now, that's the goal. You're trying to cause the disintegration of the government and the people that constitute the society. You're trying to ruin everyone's life in Iran. The theory is if you do this, everyone will go to the streets and say enough, and you'll get the sort of fantasy picture that President Trump spun out on his last Truth Social. Everybody says, we surrender, we give up, please take whatever you want, leave us alone. That's not going to happen. I mean, we tried that during World War II. It didn't really work. And even when people point to the atomic bomb, the truth is that the Soviet offensive in Manchuria, well underway, had a much bigger impact on the Japanese leadership because the last thing they wanted was to be occupied by the Soviets. They knew what that meant: mass rape, murder, oppression, destruction. So much better to surrender to the Americans. But unfortunately, people believe that you can bomb people into submission. No matter how many times you try and it fails, it doesn't matter. So I think that's where we are.
It's like that meme. We're going to do it anyway. There's all these reasons not to.
Well, there's a couple of things to think about, though, and this is very important. Things are going to get very rough next month.
Yeah.
You're going to see the proverbial chickens come home to roost. This oil and gas problem is going to spread. The fertilizer issue is real. Famine is going to break out before the end of the year in a number of different countries. But a lot of things are not going to be available to us here at home. And when Americans feel that kind of pain, they're going to look at the government and say, what did you do? And at that point, I think this government is going to be in a lot of trouble. And anybody who says, well, this was really the fault of Republicans, that's nonsense. All these Democrats are on board. They're all along for the ride. And everybody has their hands out for money. Well, there's not enough money to buy off tens of millions of angry Americans who can't feed their families, who can't get to work, who can't afford their automobiles and can't afford gas. So just tuck that away and keep in mind that that's where we're headed beyond the current war. My friends in India talked to me this morning and told me that it was $118 a barrel right now.
Wow.
If you're talking about jet fuel, then it's exceeding now $250 a barrel. That's jet fuel. That means that the airlines in many cases are going to go under. Now, people will say, well, Spirit was already in trouble. That may be true, but I know that Lufthansa has canceled thousands of flights. We're going to see much more of that. Anything involved in distillates, LPG, LNG, all these things, they're all at premium prices. Everything is going to become more expensive. When it tanks to the extent that Jeff Curie pointed out, imagine what the cost will be in this country as well as overseas. How do you get it across to President Trump that when fertilizer doesn't move, crops don't grow? When feedstock doesn't arrive, livestock don't eat. When fuel doesn't flow, trucks don't run, and trucks run on diesel. And diesel is in very short supply. Heat doesn't show up, air conditioning doesn't work, and food doesn't end up on the shelf. That's really where we're headed right now. And it's all because of the stupidity in the Persian Gulf. Now, when I listened to Secretary Rubio this morning said, what we really want is a free access and flow of traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Well, Mr. Secretary, that's exactly what you had before you attacked Iran.
Right. Now we're going back to what we already had, and that's now, I guess that's now the strategic goal in all of this is go back to where we were before we decided to start bombing them.
Right. I see my feed is full. My sort of Instagram stories are all people who are like, leave Iran alone. I do not want these prices at the pump. They're not buying it. Even if President Trump is telling these children, we had to do it, had to be done. They were going to nuke us all. Nobody buys it. Can you believe what you're seeing? And, you've been through many war propaganda cycles. This seems like the worst.
Well, it certainly is at least as bad as I remember in Vietnam. It took us a long time to figure out that, contrary to popular belief, stopping communism in Vietnam, that this was actually a civil war that we'd involved ourselves in. Here's the most important question. Who is governing our country? You got to answer that question. And for whom are in Washington governing the United States? Now, our founders, answered that question pretty clearly, actually unambiguously. They said the government of the United States derives its legitimate power from the consent of the governed, not from foreign sources, foreign courts, foreign treasuries, foreign governments, foreign interests. It comes from the American people. And go back to what you said, Clayton. He's never talked to the American people about this war. Mm-hmm. And when he did, as sort of a sideshow, when he spoke on the State of the Union, and he mentioned Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, and like trained seals, everybody stood up on both sides of the aisle and clapped.
Right.
Even though there was no such Iran.
Right. Well, that's the question.
Who is in charge?
Yeah, who is in charge? Here's a question from Southern Griffscom. I'm going to put this up on the screen. It says, how will you guys feel if Trump succeeds? He campaigned on no new wars. An Iran with no nuclear power is a better world. Otherwise, China or Russia would have sold them nukes. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, I'll just say, I don't know that Iran having its own nuclear power to support its own people is an affront to the world. I think that it would enrich and help the Iranian people. I think I would be fully supportive of them having their own nuclear power to power their buildings and infrastructure. But if Trump succeeds, how will we feel? What does success mean to?
Well, I thought we already did succeed because we blew their nuclear weapons.
They're obliterated. Yeah. Go ahead, Philip.
Well, that question defeats itself because if he campaigned on no new wars, he didn't step into this already in process. It wasn't like he just walked into a war in progress in Iran. He started it. You can't succeed. You can't succeed and then start no new wars argument. Yeah. You already lost that argument.
Colonel, what do you make of that question?
Well, first of all, India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons. We have not gone to war with either state. We hear about Pakistan because it has been, in many respects, a hotbed of radical Islam. But thus far, the Pakistani military has been very professional, exercised close control over those weapons. We know that North Korea has nuclear weapons. We also know that the North Korean dictator has been told in no uncertain terms by President Xi of China, and for that matter, President Putin, if you initiate a war with someone and use a nuclear weapon as a result, we will not support you. However, if you are attacked, that's a different story. So contrary to everyone's public criticism and insistence that North Korea could attack us at any time, it's very clear they're not going to attack us because they don't want to be obliterated. And they know that's what would happen. But they've also been told by the two nations that have acted in their behalf not to do it. So I agree with you, Clayton. If Iran develops a nuclear capability, that's Iran's business. Iran has not opened a war against anybody for over 200 years. It has not tried to expand its borders at anybody's expense for over 200 years. I think we're going to live in a world in the future that's going to be different from what we think it ought to be. It's a collection of states that have clear and unambiguous interests. And the big issue for everybody is going to be resource sovereignty. Everybody is now going to be very concerned that they have on hand all of the things that are essential to their survival. And that means energy in all forms and all types.
Resource sovereignty. I think you hit the nail on the head. Forget this unipolar world order. It is really shifting to this multipolar world order where they need to protect themselves. Go ahead, sir.
I guess when I think about who could actually do that, Africa has aligned itself greatly with China. They will have more access than they have now with sort of the crappy relationship they have with the United States and our sort of...
And France.
Right. Yeah. Europe is the one place I think that cannot do it, that cannot be resource sovereign. And, you know, they're just going to be dragged through the mud. I don't see how Europe can survive. I don't see how NATO can survive something like this. I don't know. What do you think of that? That was sort of my knee-jerk reaction.
Setting aside the possibility that the aliens that we talk about periodically operating aircraft that we can't explain may land and ultimately with us the secret to relating light, gravity, and magnetism, then I guess you're right. Europe is going to have more difficulty than most, but not totally hopeless. Right now, the largest cache of rare earths in Europe thus far has been discovered just a few 100 feet offshore from the Norwegian coast. We know there are tremendous stores of energy, rare earths, and other critical minerals in the Arctic. And the other thing is, remember that one of the reasons we ended up in this terrible position now with Russia is that we, as led by globalists, and unfortunately President Trump has not turned this around, although he promised to do so, convinced everybody that you shouldn't buy cheap energy from Russia because Russia's real insidious plan was to conquer you. Well, that was always nonsense. There's no money in territorial imperialism. I thought everybody figured that out. That's a dead end. Governing other people's nations is both wasteful, counterproductive, doesn't work well because people want to govern themselves. Right. So it's much better to do business. Germany has been practically destroyed, deindustrialized, because under its own leadership and ours, what have they done? They've cut themselves off from Russia's cheap gas. And we know historically that cheap energy, cheap credit are linked. If you don't have cheap energy, you can't get cheap credit. And that's what we're seeing happen slowly but surely with each passing day. You'll hear people will finally speak up and say, have you noticed the bond yields are rising? Yeah, they're rising. And we have a $39 trillion sovereign national debt. And how is that amassing with each passing month, with each passing year? It's unsustainable. So you need the cheap energy. If you got cheap energy, you're also combating inflation. We are in a terrible mess right now because we've killed the two, cheap energy and cheap credit. No cheap credit means you can't refinance. And right now, all the big private equity firms are in trouble. BlackRock and a host of others, because they can't refinance. They're trying to borrow money to become liquid because very few of their assets are liquid. They need liquidity. The banks need liquidity. How do you get it? You borrow it, but you can't borrow at higher and higher interest rates. So we're headed for a giant steel reinforced concrete wall. It's coming. And I don't see how we avoid it at this point. And I think that will be the end of President Trump. And I think it'll be the end of his administration. It may ultimately be the end of the government that we see right now in Washington, period, because let's face it, President Trump has done something that, as we saw during the State of the Union, everybody on the Hill supported. Now, not everybody. There were a few lone rational actors. But the point is, Washington is in this with both feet.
We got this question here. I can't believe I'm going to ask this question, Colonel, but one of our viewers, thank you for your super chat, says, would we have been better off with Kamala? Thank you for your thoughts on this. And just want to show you this Times of Israel article published during the campaign. Harris told Jewish voters all options are on the table to stop Iran from going nuclear. He was very vocal about basically going to war with Iran, even if she was elected. So, and now she's the front runner. If you look at the latest polling numbers for the 2028 election, she is now the front runner for the Democratic side. I mean, it's like I don't know, man. What do you make of this? Would we have been better off with her?
If that's remotely true, I suggest that we immediately make Natalie our candidate and run her for office.
Yes.
Save us from Kamala.
All right.
I think we can say with absolute certainty that no, we would not have been better off, and I'll tell you why. When Kamala Harris on numerous occasions demonstrated that she could not string coherent sentences together, that she was essentially an empty suit that cackled whenever provoked, the Zionist billionaires that ultimately put Trump into office turned away from the Democrats. Remember when they had Biden there, they got what they wanted. If Biden had run again, of course he couldn't do that because he was non-compos menace, but if he had, I'm sure they would have supported Biden instead of Trump. But once it became clear that Kamala was the one, everyone ran for the exit doors right away because they knew they were dealing with someone who was dangerously stupid and ignorant. So that meant you gotta support Trump, but you had to extract promises from President Trump. And one of the key promises was very simply, Israel gets whatever Israel wants.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who's in charge, it seems. You could have Ron Paul. That'd be the only chance, maybe a Thomas Massey. Colonel, I wanted to ask you, I mentioned before the break, this Washington Post report this morning. I'm sure you saw it. Brandon Weichert had reported this, I think, on Tucker Carlson's show. I think he was maybe the first to report this. We also had sources that covered this as well. We covered the injury aspect of this story, which was the devastating attacks on American infrastructure in the Middle East. A lot of the military bases there largely destroyed, a lot of infrastructure destroyed. This was, of course, kept from the American people. And now the Washington Post comes out with this report, and it's suddenly like front page story, like exclusive. The Washington Post is now telling us what Brandon Weichert reported, what we reported here on all the injury and death numbers. But now the Washington Post is reporting it, so we got that stamp of approval. Colonel, what do you make on, first of all, on the story, and then on the actual Middle East infrastructure, the U.S. military bases, and how devastated they may or may not be?
Well, I was castigated for telling everyone within the first few days that 20 of our bases had been struck and largely destroyed.
Yeah, they were saying you were lying. You were a liar.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I can tell you now, having seen the satellite pictures, I mean, we've got a lot of commercial satellite photography, so you can't hide this sort of thing for very long. And I think that's probably why the CIA decided to tell the Washington Post, go ahead and release this. Because otherwise the Washington Post would repeat whatever lies they told them to tell. And it's pretty obvious that these bases are finished. And if we were ever to get back into the Gulf region, which I highly doubt at this point, we would not want to have to rebuild all these bases. It would cost us billions of dollars. We can't afford it. And right now, who in their right mind among the Gulf states is going to try and fund it? I mean, right now, the last man standing, it's not really the last man standing, but the last one continuing to pitch for the U.S.-Israeli alliance is the UAE. And the UAE is in a lot of trouble. And that's one of the reasons over the last 24, 36 hours, you've seen strikes go in to target places in the UAE. The UAE is seen as a not so terribly secret Trojan horse for Israel. And the Iranians are sick of it. So I think two things we need to take away from this. First of all, yes, the bases are destroyed. They're done. They're finished. Number two, these Emirates are probably not going to make it through this war either. And that is dependent upon whether or not we decide to renew the war against Iran, which I think we will, sooner rather than later. I don't see how they survive. They're artificial constructs, perhaps even more artificial than the rest in the Arabian Peninsula. They can't export the oil. They can't generate the income that they have historically. You know, there's 67 million, or there were 67 million people living from the Iraqi border east down to the border with Oman. That's a lot of people. They can't stay there anymore because they're going to lose their desalination plants. They're going to lose oil infrastructure because the Iranians have made it clear that if we attack them again, they are going to do that. We will hit their desalination plants as well. I don't think there's much question about that.